We are. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emmanuel David. Welcome to the afternoon sessions for the Queer Class Relations Conference. This is the Queer Anti-Capitalism session. Oh, by the way, I said my name is Emmanuel David. Just a quick note, I'm co-editing a special issue with Matt Brim on global queer and trans class relations. So you might see call for papers circulating, and the papers here might be relevant to that as well. So keep that in mind. If you're thinking about the presentation, we have 4 presenters today on our panel. And as our first presenter, Destry Sibley mentioned, we're playing musical presentations, so they'll be out of order from what's listed on the program. Our first presenter is Destry Sibley, a literary scholar, oral historian, media producer with a PhD in English, recently from CUNY Grad Center, so congratulations. Our second presenter will be Bachsleitner, a PhD student in political science at the University of Chicago. I think after that will be Fabs Reyna, who is on the way, so we might need to pause and plug in a USB to get their presentation of Fabs Reyna is a non-binary creator, researcher, and cultural worker whose practice explores the intersection of gender, arts, and activism from a trans feminist perspective. And then finally, we have Tahara Agdasipur, an assistant professor of gender and feminist studies at Epistolary College. So because we have 4 presentations, they will run roughly about 15 minutes each, and then we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. So please join me in welcoming Destry.
All right, thank you all. Thanks for coming. I'm going to be speaking. This is not a presentation mode. Let's do that. There we go. Right? I mean,
Bottom right, you see that slider next to the slider?
yes.
And next to it, don't forget that one.
Thank you. I haven't used a PC in like a decade, so I feel like a chimpanzee with the PC. Okay, so I will be speaking about this book, The End Doesn't Happen All at Once, which is an epistolary memoir about the pandemic, written through the pandemic, co-written by a pair of friends, Reyna Born Free and Regini Srinivasan, which was published last year in 2025. And I have been thinking with this book just for the past 6 months. It's really made an impression on me, but I'm just starting to organize my thoughts around it. So thank you for giving me a venue to do that here. What I want to think about is how this epistolary memoir helps us understand time outside of capitalist exchange, how anti-capitalist time produces a kind of anti-normative sociality, and how anti-normative sociality in turn generates a different relationship to time. So there's a kind of feedback loop here between a shared subjectivity, social transformation, and time outside of the drumbeat of capitalist productivity. The first thing to notice about the book is its structure. It's an epistolary memoir, so memoir as in life writing, written from the first person personal, and epistolary as in written in letters. And in 2019, the literary critic Parul Sehgal observed the rise of this form in the contemporary literary landscape. There's a boom in publication of memoirs written in letters that has happened in the past less than a decade. And so this text is emerging within that broader trajectory or pattern, we can say. And here are just a couple other examples of books that have been written in memoirs that have been written in the epistolary form in the past decade. Ta-Nehisi Coates's memoir was written to his son. Delphine Wu's written to her grandfather, I believe. Heartland written to an unborn child. On Record Briefly Gorgeous and Heavy written to the author's respective mothers, and Harjari's written to a lover. So we have this form emerging, but let me go back. One thing that is unique, or that the ways that the book I'm writing about stands apart from these, is that it's a memoir and letters written in exchange. So in contrast to these texts, which are all written from one subject position to another subject who doesn't respond, this text is written through exchange. And I think the shared nature of the subjectivity and joint authorship of this memoir, which is a collaborative project, is really critical and sets a foundation for the transformations in the author's lives that is to come. So Srinivasan, reflecting retrospectively in that epilogue of the book, writes that in this book, identity is forged through relation. Each I appears in a dress. And so already we see here the way that the end, we'll call it, stands against an assumed imbrication of the memoir as a genre with neoliberalism, or the neoliberal turn towards a kind of hyper-individualized subject. Instead, we have here a shared subject, shared authorship, and at times even a kind of shared subjectivity. The book started, well, the project, let's say, started in March of 2020, day 19 of sheltering in place, when Born Free, who appears as C in the text, writes to Srinivasan R, will you do an art project with me for the duration of this virus? Will you write letters back and forth with me once a week? And so they do, and they write to each other for 3 years, so through peak months of the pandemic. They are, C and R, as they appear in the book, both early career academics, parents to young children, longtime friends who became friends in their doctoral program. And through the course of the pandemic, through the long weeks and months and years of isolation, their letters become a lifeline to save their sanity and possibly their lives throughout these weeks of sheltering in place with only their children and spouses for company, as many of us had to do, figured out how to work from home, homeschool, isolate, stay healthy, and stay alive. So as we remember, the pandemic was a time when the social formation of one's household became the only social formation available. And so to many, that meant that the only relationships present were the relationships of reproduction, marriage, children, partnerships, families of origin. The pandemic accelerated the social isolation that is already a feature and force of the privatized family form. And that social isolation is well apparent in the texts. 3 months into the pandemic, for example, R writes to see the loneliness is starting to hit, not the salutary solitary, but the lonely, the alienated, the separate, the alone. 6 months in, she writes again from her house, parents, partners, progeny, that's all it is now, it feels like. And 7 months in, C mirrors back the sentiment of pandemic loneliness and the intensity of care work when they write, I need something, other things to love right now. How can that be? How am I not exhausted from all the love work I'm doing? Yes, I am every day, but also the opposite, exhausted from lack of love. I'm engaged in the work of loving so few people with so much force, as if by so doing I can keep them alive, that some of the inner greenery has died off. So for these writers, the pandemic makes acutely visible the severe limitations, even cruelties, of social life organized only by and through and around the privatized nuclear family. But the letters between C and R enact a relationship that exceeds the privatized family and that is or was equally sustaining, especially through the long peak months of the pandemic. The letters embody what Foucault calls friendship as a way of life. By the summer of 2020, the first pandemic summer, the friends are already expressing the life-giving nature of their epistolary exchange long before they have an inkling that these letters will eventually turn into a book. Making this with you, a dispatch from the end of the old world, a record of communion, an exchange, sustains me in the face of all this. May we never stop writing. R writes to C in July of 2020. Later that same month, C responds, this shit is hard and long, and you are one of the few people that make it worth living through. And a year later, C echoes the sentiment again, writing that they wish for their children friendships like the ones we have, like the one we have. It's these friendships that make the catastrophe worth living through. About a quarter of the way through my reading of the book, I started paying attention to the ways that R and C begin and conclude their letters, their salutations and valedictions to each other, expressions of commitment, camaraderie, presence, devotion, and love, which is to say expressions of friendship. C, dear C, the one on the other end of the line. Dear R, well, here we are. We, a simple word that I will now always associate with you. The pronouns necessity and its impossibility, and somewhere in between there, its many actualities. You have always been like family for me, and that is only more true now. Grateful for that. With you, mon ami. And I'll break off here, but you know this dialogue with you is forever and ever. There are three elements to this last expression from C that I want to emphasize: the dialogue, the you in address, and the temporality of the forever and ever. They are each, I want to suggest, significant for this text, these letters, but also for what the pandemic surfaced and what it can help us understand about time outside of capitalist exchange and how it produces anti-normative sociality. The letters serve as a way for these two friends to save each other through the isolation and monotony of the pandemic, as a way to exceed the social boundaries of a family and home, but they also serve as a way to mark the progression of the pandemic through different registers of time, how the pandemic changed the nature of time or the feeling of it. For these two subjects, as for many of us who were not essential workers, the pandemic interrupted capitalist time, propelling us into a different relationship to productivity. C and R each refer to the time of the pandemic as an endless present, an impossible time, a time that feels futureless, or a time out of time. It's March again, they write to each other at intervals, the return of March becoming a repeated refrain and nod to the cyclical quality of pandemic time. It's March again in March 2021 and 2022 and 2023, but it is also a March again for them at other months of the pandemic when virus contagion surges or new variants emerge. It's back to the beginning, they say, again and again. And at one point, R writes, I don't know where we are or why we're here. I'm not sure when we are either. It all keeps on and on. The world keeps ending and the world goes on. How to live in this time of no time, the friends ask each other. An undercurrent to each letter and to the book in its entirety is this question: how are we to live in this time of social and ecological collapse? The pandemic made more visible the fissures that were and are already present in the dominant world order. It revealed the gross inequities and harsh injustices of a world strained against itself, in which people are trained to think only of themselves and the members of their families as the protagonists of their lives. How are we to live? How are we to raise our children? These questions evoke others, both how do we live and survive in time, but also what do we do with the time, the limited time that we have here? C speaks to this tension when they write in August of 2021, 16 months into the pandemic. It's as if I, you, we, and note the collapse of the pronouns, are stretched between two temporalities: the timeline of continuity, get the kids fed, get them to camp, get them to bed, and the timeline of collapse, living through the endless end of the world. Our response to this in her next letter with her own reflection on time: what time is it? Meaning also, what timeline are you in? She continues, I don't have it here, but she continues, I hear your formulation of continuity and collapse, the constancy and rivalry of both, the impossibility of the present, the politics of the meantime, the unthinkability of the future, also no future, the necessity of getting the kids in the car with their shoes on, playing the same old games, keeping the dance party going, being enough for them, even when we aren't quite enough for ourselves. For both, the timeline of normalcy and reproduction, as C calls it, requires the intellectual, emotional, and material suppression of the reality of unevenly distributed collapse. We can not only think about mass death, environmental destruction, and the global rise of fascism, and how we might respond to each, when we are also trying to get a toddler to put on their shoes. The shoes would never get put on, the kids would never get in the car, there would be no games, no dance party, no care. This is the constancy and rivalry of the politics of the meantime. So what timeline are you in? Continuity or collapse? These seem to be the temporal options available to us in the capitalist time of the 21st century. And yet, the pandemic era letters between these friends create an alternative temporality, a different timeline. When C and R write to each other, They are neither in the timeline of continuity nor collapse. Rather, they are in both at once while simultaneously exceeding each. The very act of letter writing removes the subjects from those timelines. C in September of 2020 writes in one letter that they were trying to think of what I could do to restore myself, and I remembered that I could write you. How lucky I am that you are here or there, in somewhere, interwhere, in any case, reachable, writable, listening, and forgiving. The timeline of letter writing in friendship is an alternate timeline altogether. So the anti-capitalist conditions of time that the pandemic generated, for these authors, the conditions of possibility for the literary narrative structure of the epistolary memoir. And in turn, this narrative structure foregrounds a queer relational mode of social life across space and time that engenders transformational possibilities for and within each subject through their friendship with each other. I want to imagine a new world, R writes early in the pandemic, and it seems clearer now than ever that it has to start with reimagining the minutes, or reimagining of the minutes. So the act of letter writing becomes a microcosmic, hyper-local step towards how to do that. And that, in so doing, transformation does occur for them. Through the course of the book, through the course of the pandemic, R and C each undergo profound metamorphoses, individually and together. Their friendship undergoes a radical change that I don't want to spoil the plot, because you all should read it, it's really good. But this is not to say it's a simple narrative of easy friendship. There is challenge. So their friendship undergoes transformation. And they also go through profound transformation themselves. Genders change, names change, conceptions of self change, academic careers expand and contract, family relationships are irreparably altered, neurodivergences are diagnosed, moves take place, other books get written, family fortunes expand at one point, children grow, communities shift and end and sprout. For both authors, but especially for C, the alternative temporality of the pandemic and the continual exchange of letters throughout provides a terrain for profound transformation vis-a-vis their relationship to the normative. This transformation is most clearly articulated when C writes, as long as we are writing, so through the epistolary exchange, I know we are keeping faith, continuously creating the rupture in normal, continuously creating the idiorhythmic space of togetherness that is the real rebellion against the fragmented alienation of normal, that utterly awful ordinary pursuit to define ourselves not only by what we each individually make, earn, spend, achieve, which is to say capitalist productivity. So what comes first? The change in sociality, the change in capitalist time, the change in oneself. All of it, the book tells us, all at once, transforms life and brings forth new ways of being in the world. It's never over and it's always beginning, an endless present, and each page brings us to the next page. Thank you.
I don't have slides, which is always a bit of a flop when you're in between people. Okay, while we're working on that, I'm just going to go ahead and start. My name is Sibley. Thank you for coming out today. The paper I'm presenting today is currently on its third working title, namely Beyond Transliberalism, which tells you two things. Firstly, that I've been working on it for too long, and also that it's nowhere near finished. So got to start somewhere. The hope is to use the tools of political theory, which is what I study, to kind of clarify different ways of thinking about trans politics beyond the liberal trans rights paradigm. Transliberalism is examined recently by Jules Gill-Peterson and much earlier by Nat Rojo. Privileges a politics of recognition over any consideration of transitions materiality. Transliberalism understands transitions the expression of an individual identity, which ought to be recognized and included, which is usually politically translated into a framework of individual rights. borrowing from critiques of queer liberalism as describing the shift from gay liberation activism towards gay rights activism. The critique of transliberalism similarly targets a jettisoning of the critique of the family and capitalism in favor of a kind of assimilationism. The point is, of course, not to condemn all rights-based appeals in the moment when we're kind of losing them, but to, in Wendy Brown's words, refuse them any predetermined place in an emancipatory politics. So this paper looks beyond transliberalism for a kind of archive of trans-political thought, which politicizes trans experience as revealing the need for a deep transformation of the status quo. You might think that, we should just embrace negativism or pessimism or so in response, and I think there's good reasons for that. But for the purposes of this paper, I'm interested in thinkers who kind of point towards political possibility, who are utopians even. That used to be kind of a key analytic, which I think still comes through, in an effort to see where this goes. Specifically, I offer a non-exhaustive typology of 3 different ways of thinking about trans politics beyond transliberalism, and highlight their underlying logics. Deirdre McCloskey's trans-libertarianism, Sean Fay's trans-anti-capitalism, and Paul Preciado's Uranian trans-utopianism. I assess these and conclude by highlighting a tension between the latter 2, suggesting that the attempt to resolve them, to resolve this tension motivates recent developments in the literature on queer or trans-anti-capitalism in particular. And you can see that the sources I pull from are kind of very late 2010s, early 2020s, very Euro. So obviously a lot has happened since then, and it's very non-exhaustive, but the hope is that the taxonomy kind of still clarifies how we might approach new developments in queer anti-capitalism or trans anti-capitalism in particular. So the first logic is exemplified by libertarian trans economist Deirdre McCloskey, who sees in her experience of transitioning the source of a libertarian argument. In her memoir, Crossing, she describes the harrowing experience of being forcibly institutionalized by her sister to stop her from transitioning in the 1990s. She rightly rejects this as paternalistic. Like with any other big life decision, we might not understand the value of such a choice, like getting married, buying a house, starting a degree or whatever, but we think it would be wrong to prevent someone from making this kind of decision for themselves. I think there are resonances here with the kind of reasoning that Andrew Long-Chu sometimes marshals in her rejection of medical gatekeeping. For example, one has a right to do with one's body as one pleases, whether this is conducive to one's happiness even or not. So it's a matter of a kind of fundamental right. The libertarian logic, well, it's not to say she's the libertarian, but whatever. The libertarian logic works according to a conception of freedom of self-ownership, which should be quite legible to a kind of American audience. As McCloskey puts it, the freedom question is, well, why not? I'm free up to your nose. As long as I'm not hurting you, then I'm allowed to do it. This is a perfect example of it. I don't hurt anyone by being a woman. She draws explicitly on Robert Nozick, who of course gives us this argument, starting from the body as the ultimate sphere of non-interference and inviolability, and arguing that because everyone is the rightful owner of their body, they may contract with others on the market to use it as they see fit. And the libertarian minimal state has no right to interfere. This, of course, if anything, protects that. This, of course, includes changing the body, and this is how we get the connection between the freedom to transition and market freedom. And trans people in this view essentially consumers of transition-related care. This doesn't sound very utopian on the face of it, but I think there is a positive kind of vision here, which I think becomes clear if we consider the unappreciated 3rd chapter of Anarchy, State and Utopia by Nozick. So this vision is animated by a faith in the market as a force for liberatory change. Nozick envisions his utopia as a kind of meta-utopia of different worlds, a free marketplace of worlds, which the thought is best placed to determine which kinds of arrangements are most desirable in the long run. This is essentially a radicalization of John Stuart Mill's idea of experiments in living. And as a liberatory vision for trans people, I think this way of thinking has a kind of techno-optimist dimension most commonly, which sees transition as a kind of transhumanist biohacking. Some even envision the ability to kind of upload one's mind into the cloud or whatever, such that one can freely choose one's virtual form and become liberated from the body itself, and sexual difference as well with that. The problem, of course, is that this is neither a realistic theory of change nor a self-ownership desirable conception of freedom. There's not a meaningful difference enough between not being able to transition because it's disallowed by the state and not being able to transition because one is a propertyless proletarian. McCloskey's advice to trans people struggling with unemployment and homelessness to, quote, work hard to get a job is doubly cruel given the fact that trans people disproportionately suffer from market forces due to, among other things, discrimination and the costs of transition. So in this next section, I consider an account which basically takes this sociological fact as its starting point. namely the argument in John Fay's 2019 book, The Transgender Issue. Since then, obviously, a lot has been written in the broad category of trans-Marxism, but I do think it's interesting for how it comes out of and responds to the specific British context of the time. One thing that helped the ascent of anti-trans feminists there, I think, was this thing of this conception of transness as a bourgeois phenomenon by many on the left. And there was this periodic kind of outrage over the cost of surgeries, which extremely few people were getting on the NHS, but was a kind of political thing. So against this implicit association, Fay notes that trans people are in fact disproportionately working class, subject to poverty, abandonment, and violence, and as such, and highlights the importance of sex work, and as such, there can be no trans liberation under capitalism, is the thing that she says. So the logic of Fay's argument resembles that of the Combahee River Collective's famous Black feminist statement. The Combahee argues that it is because of their specific economic, social, and class position, quote, at the bottom, that the liberation of Black lesbian women demands the destruction of all major systems of oppression. So this is what, identity politics proper, is what they call this. The thought is that liberating those most disadvantaged by its socioeconomic hierarchy requires liberating all. As they put it, well, if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free. When Fay argues that trans liberation requires the end of capitalism, then she politicizes trans identity as a social position, which entails being disadvantaged by the political economy of capitalism, which requires a certain level of unemployment, a certain way of marking people out for certain kinds of labor, as well as an assumption of scarcity and a kind of ideological consensus that differentiates the deserving from the undeserving and deems some expenditures frivolous luxuries. This account, reveals that whose declarations of want we take seriously enough to classify them as needs is ultimately a deeply political question. But there's a limit to the logic, or a few limits to the logic of her argument, which the parallel to the Combahee shows. Kiaga Yamata Taylor notes that the Combahee's identity politics were radical precisely because Black women were so overwhelmingly at the bottom of class hierarchy in the US, and that concerted strategic efforts by the political right to promote Black capitalism resulted in upward mobility for some Black people, creating the conditions of possibility for an anti-racist politics, which is now also an anti-capitalist politics. Fay's argument similarly hinges on trans people's relative socioeconomic disadvantage, and comparable developments in theory significantly reduce the force of her anti-capitalist argument from the perspective of trans liberation. The same kinds of arguments used to be made about gay people as well, which, lots of merit. But I think all of us know enough evil corporate gays to question this kind of sociological kind of argument as a ground for queer anti-capitalism now, especially when you add to this the other limit to the logic, the heavily racialized differentiation of class disadvantage and exposition to violence among trans people themselves. Even more optimistically, perhaps, one might wonder whether anti-capitalism and trans liberation are totally coextensive. Fay gestures at social reproduction theory, which I won't go into now. The idea is that capitalism in some sense depends on gender, and that therefore abolishing capitalism would go a long way in serving trans liberation too. I think this is right, but we've reason to think it won't go all the way. The history of state socialism shows that the family proved time and time again to be an efficient way of allocating resources under conditions of productivism, if you think that this is in some sense separate from capitalism. So if we're interested in a positive kind of vision of trans liberation, I think it's worth thinking about whether we can denaturalize gender a bit further. And this is precisely what I think in part animates the third logic that I'm going to explain now, using the example of Paul Preciado's 2020 book, An Apartment on Uranus. Preciado associatively moves from the experience of transition to the transgression of other confining borders, including quite literal ones. And he makes a lot of the idea of naturalization as the process of acquiring a nationality through citizenship and kind of the gendered requirements there. Transition for him reveals something more broadly about how boundaries which seem natural to us are permeable and thus ultimately contingent, and also function to kind of are erected to serve a nationalist reproductive future. Preciado chronicles his experience of gender policing as he travels through Europe without matching documents and, quote, dreams of an apartment on Uranus where he can live free of the modern power taxonomies of race, gender, class, or disability. And he gives us a kind of queer or trans interpretation of the story in Plato's St. Paul's Symposium about the people that were split in two. And so, and that as the origin of love. So wholeness is a kind of ideal here. And here I think we have the use of a denaturalizing logic for a positive political vision of freedom as the overcoming of problematic splits or dualisms or borders, which can keep people confined. Now, those who are familiar with the text and also Preciado in general know that it's a highly problematic one, since at various points he metaphorically identifies with racialized subjects, qua their experience of marginalization, obscuring the vast differences between the experience of transitioning as a white person and forced migration, for example, and structurally forecloses the possibility of an intersectional perspective, which of course exists and has been pointed out in the Latin American decolonial transfeminisms of Maria Lugones and Gloria Anzaldúa, for example. The most plausible version of the thought then is that transition, although not exactly like other experiences of transgression, points to a basis for solidarity for those for whom freedom from naturalized categories and the structures that sustain them is essential. This, I take it, is what Angela Davis has in mind when she says that, quote, the trans community taught us that it is possible to effectively challenge that which is considered the very foundation of our sense of normalcy. So if it is possible to challenge the gender binary, then we can certainly effectively resist prisons, jails, and police. It might be that the problem lies in Preciado's specific method of association, but we might also wonder whether there's something to, as has recently been argued as well, to the utopian form proper itself, locating the possibility of liberation not only in the future, but spatially in a place far away, which is kind of might be necessarily ahistorical and reproduces rather than challenges effectively the logic of synthetic colonialism. Another challenge to the logic of denaturalization comes from a kind of refusal to denaturalize gender or sex all the way down. We might instead follow Andrew Long Chu's recent use of radical feminists Shulam Firestone, who argued that sex and even sexual hierarchy might be natural and yet not necessary and therefore eliminable. There's lots more to be said about this, but the question of how to position ourselves in relation to nature, in a sense, is somewhat of an open question. And these three logics, but the point is, I guess, to show that it's political all the way down. So these three logics then offer us a kind of glimpse of the breadth of questions you can get to from the politicization of trans experience. On a normative level, we can discern underlying conceptions of freedom that do this work, kind of negative conception of freedom as self-ownership, a positive conception focusing on material conditions, stability, and a deconstructive one. The reason I think it's important to contend with translibertarianism in particular is that it's always readily available to fall back on, especially when we're marshalling concepts of autonomy in all kinds of transpolitical discourses. So I'd like to conclude then with highlighting a tension between the logic of identity politics and the logic of denaturalization, which I think continues to be a kind of challenge for thinking about trans life in material terms. The former, trans phase account kind of does this, takes an identity category as given that of being trans and considers it as a kind of social position with specific material interests, whereas the latter seeks to deconstruct this very identity category, but thereby sidesteps the kind of intermediary analysis of concrete social institutions. And as a matter of strategy, there's of course always a tension between mobilizing categories of political action and uncovering the ways in which these categories themselves can constrain us, or in some sense, false. Now, I want to suggest that the turn to value theory in recent trans-materialist or Marxist literature represents an effort to run these two logics together by thinking about how a system of value marks out certain bodies or subjects and gives them a place in a political economic system, thereby positioning and denaturalizing at once, and an attempt to kind of theorize the political economic more fully than, say, Faye does. I don't think this turn resolves all questions about the relation between gender and capitalism that I raised earlier, but insofar as it represents a resolution of this kind of antinomy or intent to do so, I'm excited to see where it goes, and I will evaluate it in the next paper. I hope that this taxonomy is nonetheless kind of helpful in thinking about how different approaches are motivated and in orienting us as we move forward. Thank you.
So are we supposed to be sharing the screen with the Zoom people?
I believe the Zoom,
Or screen sharing, this is so they can see the slides and stuff.
is the screen sharing on?
It's just audios. I'm not sure why, but that's they decided to make it only. Sorry,
I
yeah.
want to make it sorry.
No, thanks for us.
Yeah, I think it's only audio and the streaming. Well, thank you all so much for being here and for giving us a little bit of your time and your attention also. I'm Fabs. And in this presentation, I want to talk to you about two feminist film collective in Peru. I don't know how many of you know about Peru, how much do you know about Peru? But it's almost like that. Well, Peru is this amazing, beautiful country, very tragic country also. It includes a little bit of the coast, the Andean region, and the Amazon in South America. So these two feminist collectives are separated by 3 decades. First is Warmi, Colectivo de Cine y Video. This is the first women's film collective in Peru, and the second one is Chola Contravisual, a collective that currently uses audiovisual tools as part of their activism. Both operate from a transfeminist perspective and seek to challenge Lima's cultural centralism. Lima is the capital of Peru, as well as to make visible the racism, classism, and social inequalities in the country. And what I want to show you is what their experience tells us about the relationship between politics, race, class, and cultural production, and how time itself can be queer. The argument is simple. In Peru, making transfeminist cinema has always required building alternative economic structures. At the same time, cinema has been a tool for building alternative communities in the middle of political violence and institutional precarity, where cultural and gender policies are extremely fragile and in some cases non-existent. So let's go back to Peru in 1989. So this is the year Warmi was created. The internal armed conflict between terrorist groups Sendero Luminoso, the MRTA, and the state is at its peak, and the violence is concentrated in the Andean highlands, Ayacucho, Huancavelica, Junín, the same regions that will later become Chola Contravisual's territory. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission would later document that the majority of victims were Quechua-speaking peasants from the Sierra, communities the Peruvian state had abandoned economically and then treated as a war zone. At the same time, hyperinflation under Alan Garcia's government is destroying the economy. This banner that you're seeing was carried through the streets of El Agustino, a working class district in Lima, in October of 1989. It reads, "You shall not kill, neither with hunger nor with bullets." Both threats were real. In this period of economic, political, and armed conflict crisis, LGBTQ people were a particularly vulnerable target. This is a press clipping from also 1989. The headline reads, "MRTA in Tarapoto, cleaning out criminals and informants." This article refers to a selective massacre of 8 LGBTQ people carried out on May 1989 by the MRTA in Tarapoto, Peru. It was a hate crime and an act of social cleansing. The victims were taken out of a disco and shot for being considered social scum. This is the context in which Maria Barea founded Warmi, together with Emilia Torres and Marilu Perez. Maria Barea began her career in the early 1970s. She worked on Andean films throughout the decade. She was a producer, a manager, a collaborator. She knew how to make films happen in Peru in ways that most of her male colleagues did not. By the early 80s, she was part of the Chasqui Collective, one of Peru's most important political cinema groups, made up mostly of men. And she had been excluded from recognition, from credits, from creative decisions consistently. As she describes in her interview, she was never allowed to think with her own head. So in 1989, she made a decision. She would build her own space. This is Warmi's founding leaflet, the one on the right, preserved in the Reversible archive. Warmi described itself as the first collective of women in national filmmaking. Their stated goals: to research, produce, and promote audiovisual work centered on women's life, working class community, and social transformation. Warmi's organizational model was horizontal and community-based. All women crews, collaboration with organizations their films were made with, domestic worker unions, neighborhood groups. Their films were not made about working class women, they were made with them. Because I wanted to study, a film made in that same year, 1989, was co-created with domestic workers. Antuca tells the story of an Andean migrant woman in Lima, daughters of the war, works with girl gangs in Ayacucho, the heart of the conflict zone. In terms of film policy, there was a decree from 1972 made by Velasco that guaranteed mandatory exhibition of national films. It was imperfect, but it made oppositional cinema viable. There was a circuit and audience. Then, in 1992, Fujimori's decree eliminated it entirely. Warmi's feature film, Antuca, was finished, ready, but it never had the opportunity of a theatrical release. Now let's move to Peru in 2015. It's like 3 decades after. So this is Lima in 2015. These women are lying down in the street as part of the Déjala Decidir, Let Her Decide campaign for abortion discrimination in Peru. Their bodies are the argument. It's in this moment, in these marches, in this specific political urgency, that Chola contra Visual is born. Their funding question is not what films do we want to make, but how can audiovisual tools serve this struggle? They begin not as a filmmaker who became political, but as political actor who took the camera. Chola contra Visual is in itself a political claim. Chola refers to a person with indigenous or Andean features. Historically, the term carried a pejorative charge used by upper classes as a strategy of discrimination. Today, however, it has been reclaimed as an identity. And contravisual, against the dominant visual. The logo is a masked face with a third eye, braids surrounded by fire. Defiance is built into the image. Now I want to stay with this timeline for a moment, because this is the present context in which Chola is working, and because it rhymes with 1989 in ways that are not coincidental. Between 2023 and 2025, the Peruvian Congress and state institutions have systematically attacked LGBTQ rights and cultural freedom. The anti-film law that caps funding and enables censorship of human rights content, the elimination of the gender perspective from all public policies, the Ministry of Health classifying trans identities as mental disorder, the censorship of the biggest LGBTQ film festival, and a congressional commission to investigate public funds awarded to films with a gender and human rights perspective. This is not a backlash. It is a coordinated dismantling. And just as in 1989, the political violence is simultaneously cultural and economic. It targets the infrastructures that make alternative cultural production possible. And in the middle of all this is Chola contra Visual in 2024. The Hawaspa Cutipai, an encounter with Quechua and Aymara filmmakers in Huancayo. People sitting in a circle, colored cards arranged on the group, working together, not despite the hostile context, but inside of it. Okay, so Chola contra Visual was founded in Lima in 2015 and then moved to Huancayo, in the central Andean highlands of Peru. In 2017, they created La Munay, a feminist cultural house that was not just a production space, but a community space. Artists, activists, friends, lovers, all under one roof. The pandemic forced them to close it, but it also opened the possibility of itinerancy. They organized events in Ayacucho, then Huancavelica, and those processes wove networks with other collectives. On film policy, the anti-film law is a direct successor of Fujimori's 1992 decree in structural terms. Both moments represent the state of removing the material conditions that make independent, politically radical cinema possible. The difference is that in 2025, the attack is also explicit anti-LGBT. It is ideological as well as economic. Okay, the organization model is radically self-managed. For people, a network of collaborators across territories. The collective redistributes whatever money comes in with other artists. Thematically, Chola Contravisual works at the intersection of queer Andean identities, decolonial transfeminism, memory, and territory. For Geraldine, the co-founder, it is important to recognize that queerness is not important from the global north. It was already present in Andean artistic traditions, just invisibilized by two overlapping colonialisms, Lima and the Northern Academy. So what does this comparison tell us? 3 decades apart, these two collectives face structurally identical conditions. A state that dismantles the infrastructure they need at the crucial moment, institutions that constantly attack gender policies and LGBT people, and an economy that makes their survival precarious by design. And both collectives respond with the same practice, autogestión, self-management, building their own infrastructure, creating alternative economies where collective care, artistic process, and political life are inseparable. Not as a utopian vision, as the only viable practice from where they stand. Time queers itself here. 1989 and 2015 do not form a line of progress. They form a spiral. The conditions rhyme without being identical. What persists is not the violence, but the refusal. As Geraldine puts it, it has always been there. It is a living art and also a living memory. That living memory, passed between generations of Andean transfeminist filmmaker, is a subject of this presentation. Thank you.
It's already started. There's another window open.
I'm trying to pause it.
If you go move your mouse to the Zoom icon on
The bottom or?
the bottom,
Mm.
and then you see that.
Oh,
Yeah.
here we go.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Say a pause on it?
good, where you just were with the more,
Yeah.
and then about halfway up, it says pause. Go up, right there. Down.
I'm sorry.
Yes, thank you. Get us started. Thank you.
So for the last presentation, thanks for that. And I am just still struck with the amount of whiteness culturally and in thought that there is from these influencers and, individualism, bootstraps, mentality and meritocracy. And I'm wondering what it looks like to resist that or to call that into question, how that might be done.
Like how to resist the influencers.
Or having to create like a counter narrative or to encourage to question those lines of thinking.
Yeah, I think that's hard. That's like a, how do we resist neoliberalism kind of question? And it's like, if I knew that, I would have tenure. At a minimum, I'd have tenure by now. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Like, I think truly it's organizing, right? It's like just legit organizing work. I also think it's important to notice when it's happening, like this feels sometimes really specialized to people, but it's not. Like there's the chapter that this is from, like talks about, if y'all saw like Chapel Rowan's acceptance speech where she's just like, I demand healthcare and good wages and whatever. Within 48 hours, the news articles, instead of talking about the like economic demands, were saying Chapel Rowan manifested her Grammy win because there was this like video of her when she was 12 saying, I'm gonna get a Grammy no matter what. So it's like this thing is everywhere. So I feel like there's a little bit of space to be like, no, people should be able to believe what they want to believe in. And it's like, yeah, totally. And this is actually doing like material damage. And I feel like being able to name that while holding space for like the spiritual practices people want is important.
Can you say something about that too? I do some research that's similar related to the family and parental responsibility and how individualized those things. And I think there's also, it's helpful to know, to learn like the history and how these ideas are manufactured as common sense, but it hasn't always been that way. And I think back to like Clinton's welfare reform bill, which was as much material economic policy as it was an ideological shift towards privatized responsibility about economic future. So knowing that like, this is a manufactured idea, and so other ideas can be manufactured.
Yes, a question back.
First off, thank you so much for the perfect panel. I have a question that is in response to Dr.'s presentation, but also towards the presentation on transliberalism. I'm really interested in the origins of some of this manifestation of a longer history of self-actualization, New Age movements, etc. And we know that many forms of queer and trans politics, in addition to a loving, abiding use of astrology, have really tight origins in the 1960s and 70s to different forms of self-help and self-actualization movements. So I'm really curious from both of you differently, whether in sort of in looking at forms of social media and other expressions, how ideas of queer, LGBT, trans identity is expressed or there, and whether or not you see in these different vectors of if not manifestation, that I will slot it into transliberalism, but perhaps otherwise ideas of self-actualization ideals. But
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think like self-actualization like is one of like thinking in this kind of like normative political philosophy kind of like framework is you know, can go so many different ways, right? Like it can be a normative core at like a bunch of different politics, like for example, libertarian one that I kind of like tried to explore, but that one is, I think, like it's a kind of the one that I was I was kind of thinking through the move from this more defensive kind of like posture, right, which I think is where this starts from, to a more kind of like utopian one. And then I think there is like I think it's helpful to think about those kind of subjective narratives then also in making that transition, right? Like how do I get there? And but that's something I think I need to think a bit more about and think through like the social media kind of like manifestations of this. I think about this in like context of masculinity a lot today, kind of like the ways in which like these mappings, these are all mappings of the world to an extent, right? And so yeah, I think I'm just thinking more about like the queer and trans like versions of this, you know, online as well. I think it's really like helpful to think about that. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, I'm not sure. If you're asking about how the identity formation happens through the self-help stuff or the other ways that queer and trans identity stuff pops up.
more the former, like what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know,
Okay, I know there's. I'm thinking, do you know like Anne Svetkovich's like, what if depression is structural? And I'm just like, yeah, like what if identity, like what if you don't need a bunch of self-help stuff because the world like isn't transphobic? What would that look like? How would we come to understand each other and ourselves and like build relation from a more like what I can freely give space than like having to like heal myself through these like neoliberal understandings of like who I am to go outside to find that, to be able to form relation is like the byproduct of capitalism more than anything else, I think.
I'm sorry.
And may I have a quick question for Reyna and Destry? What is your thoughts on the relationship between queer anti-capitalism and the continuities or discontinuities with time? Because in your presentation, the time was disrupted in interesting ways, and in your presentation, you were mapping these two groups across this period. So any thoughts on like temporalities or continuities or discontinuities with time?
Well, what I realized doing this presentation and doing other research is that actually I wasn't that aware, but actually time is also here. I mentioned that in the research. We're in a cycle of being in the same kind of political context. I feel like we can feel like there's different situations that, I don't know, 3 decades ago, 5 decades ago, but at the end it's the same. It's a group of people fighting for, the rights, a context that tries to mask this material precarity for, I don't know, like ideology precarity, to mix the two of them. And yeah, so I feel like we are just like in this cycle. Yeah, in like a time is not linear and we're just doing the same all over, like over and over.
Thank you.
I think the way I think about it is that, related to how ideas are manufactured, I think what this book helped me think about is that how in capitalism we're given kind of two, especially right now in the 21st century, we're given like these two options of two temporalities, which is the temporality of continuity and then the temporality of collapse. And part of how we are going to think our way through collapse is by finding other ways to orient to the minutes, as one of the writer says. So part of what we have to think through differently is how we actually relate to time, and finding ways to locate in between those two or exceed those two temporalities of collapse and continuity. And then similarly, we have to think outside of the social structures that we've inherited. We've been very before and privatized social relationship. So in both cases, we have kind of like the privatization of time through capitalism and privatization of relationship through their family. And in both cases, we're using a property framework to understand that which is most alive in us, which is our relationality and our minutes. Oh yeah, we gotta go. So
On that note, a round of applause for our presenters. Thank you. If you have additional questions, I'm sure that they'd be willing to speak with you after. So enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you for being here.
That's great, thank you.